Welcome back to Ask the Educator, a podcast for all professionals involved in medical device processing and sponsored by Healthmark Industries. The education team here at Healthmark has 280 years of combined experience in areas ranging from sterile processing, endoscopy, OR, biomed, to hospital and industry leadership. Our goal is to leverage our collective experience to answer one of your questions each episode, giving you the practical tips you need to succeed in the evolving world of device processing. My name is Kevin Anderson, clinical educator here at Healthmark, and I will be your host. Let's get started. Welcome back, everyone, to the Ask the Educator podcast. In this episode, we're going to do something a little bit different. I think we'll dub this show the Hands Across the Water edition. The reason we'll call it that is because I have with me today Adam Okada, SPD manager from California, and Harry Oussoren, Sterile Medical Device Expert from the Netherlands. I want to thank you both for coming on the show. Before we get started, Adam, would you please just take a moment to introduce yourself to our audience?
Sure. My name is Adam Okada. I'm currently the educator at Community Medical Centers in Fresno, California. I've been in sterile processing for 15 years. I've been at every level as a frontline tech for about 9 years and then worked my way up into management and education. I got started in sterile processing because my dad wanted me out of the house and gave me a flyer. He worked at a hospital, gave me a flyer for a sterile processing course, and I just decided to take it. And over the years, kind of fell in love with it, and I'm very excited to be here.
That's awesome, Adam. Well, thanks for joining us. And Harry, would you mind just introducing yourself real quick?
Yes, of course. My name is Harry Oussoren. I used to be an OR nurse, and now since 11 years, I work in the Amsterdam at the University Hospital as an expert in sterile medical devices, which means that I'm responsible for the quality of the processes of the CSSD departments.
All right. Wow, that's a cool job title, and maybe something that we should adopt here or something. I don't know. It sounds really cool.
I would love to be called an expert. Absolutely.
That is awesome. All right. So without any further ado, let's get into it. For this episode, we wanted to get an idea of how each of your departments has been affected by the pandemic. So the question is, what change in your department has occurred, and what have you had to deal with? And do you think it will last above and beyond the end of this pandemic? And Adam, why don't we start with you on this one?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, there's been a lot of changes. Once COVID hit and we realized how serious it was, the staff obviously had a lot of questions about decontamination, whether their PPE was sufficient, things like that. And we had to kind of reassure them about standard precautions and kind of remind them that the PPE they have is meant to protect them from everything, including COVID. So there was a lot of fear and a lot of questions around that. As far as the processes, obviously PPE shortages caused a lot of problems. We started seeing some different items come into decontamination areas, including, goggles, things like that, which are a pain to dry, those straps on the goggles. And then obviously N95 masks, which are, we have a worldwide shortage. So I think every hospital is kind of dealing with that. We know we need the N95s for the frontline staff to deal with the COVID patients, and we needed to figure out a way to decontaminate those. So I think those have been the two things, the goggles and the N95 masks are the two biggest ones that I've seen. And then will it continue beyond the pandemic? I don't think so. I think the cost of reprocessing is high. So I don't think that it'll be used after this, but you never know how long this is going to go. I mean, there's a lot of, every time I call materials to get a package of gowns or a package of hair covers, anything, they always tell me, hey, there's a shortage. We got back orders. And once that happens, it's tough to know. It's tough to know how long it'll last.
Yeah, it makes you wonder, how supply chain might evolve through this pandemic and come through on the outside of it. If any changes will occur, and maybe some of this stuff will be made here in the States or closer to, where any of the end users are. So like for Harry, maybe the manufacturers there, who knows, maybe they'll start doing more of their own PPE there. But for us here in the States, it was like an emergency FDA clearance. I don't know how all that works overseas, Harry, but that was sort of our green light here that ended up saving us. So
Yeah, we were of course closely following the United States. What's going to happen over there? And I saw a lot of messages: FDA clears whatever sterilizer, etc., etc. Like Adam, there was a lot of questions from the staff about how am I going to be protected? What new procedures do we need to have? And it took us not too long, but we really wanted to put in a lot of effort because I think it is so important to protect our own people. So let's take some time for that. That's what we said. So after having that done, we found out that, like Adam had, we had a really problem with the filtering phase piece respirators. And then, especially in the Netherlands or in Europe, we call it FFP 1, 2, or 3 masks. The FFP2 is equivalent to the N95 mask in the United States. So this was one of the problems. The goggles were a problem, but in my hospital also the isolation gowns were a problem. So what do they have to wear to protect themselves? And then they came to us and said, okay, these are our problems, and we are in very close contact with the supply chain in our hospital. So we also try to predict where is going to be a problem, probably. So let's see if we can look how to solve that problem before it arises. But now we were confronted with these masks. And like Adam said, we needed to find a way to reprocess them. But to me, reprocessing is not the only thing what was important. It was also how do we test if these masks are still efficient and according to the value that they need to filter. For example, the N95 mask in your state needs to filter 95% of the particles. In the FFP2, it needs to be 94. So Adam, a question to you. How did you know that after you reprocessed them in whatever way, that it was still safe to use? Who tested it and how did they test it? Do you know that?
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. Yeah, safety is obviously the number one priority. I mean, when this whole thing started and they were talking about reprocessing, the N95 masks, that was my first thought was like, no, we're not going to do this. I mean, this is going to be dangerous. This is going to be, if it's not clean, it can't be sterile, right? That's the first thing you learn in sterile processing. And so at first I was like, we're not doing this. The more I looked into it and the more that I realized there was a lot of testing going on as far as 3M with their kinds of masks, the sterilizer companies like Steris, ASP, Stryker, everybody that's kind of jumped in and tried to say that, hey, we have a process for reprocessing these. I started to look into it more. I started to see the research that was done by Duke, that was done by Battelle and all these other companies that were doing this. And I got a little more comfortable with it. So once we started our process of decontamination, we would send them to the employee health and to our OR staff to do fit testing because they had fit testing capabilities in both locations. So we always make sure that we have about 10% of our masks that we test to make sure that the filter is working on them. And that way, that if they're fit testing and we know that they're passing, then at least the mask is functional. And that's what we want. We don't want the nurses to go onto the floor with a COVID patient and not have something. So that was the most important thing for us.
That's great, Adam. And great question, Harry. And it makes me wonder, did you guys track the mask to the individual, or were they just kind of refitting to whatever size, like generic size N95 they were size 2 prior to?
In our process, we do try to get it back to the individual user. We have them write their name, their unit, and we try to get it back to them.
How about you, Harry? Did you guys do some testing as well?
Yeah, we did a lot of testing. And when you look at all the norms that stand for it, it was very hard to do because you have to do, according to the European norms or guidelines, you have to do a wet particle test. And there was only one machine that was able to do that in the Netherlands. And that machine was immediately confiscated by our government. And it was used because we also tried to get masks from abroad. And this machine was used to test them. Because we do not only import the N95 mask, but we also import from China or whatever we call the N95 masks. And you see a lot of differences between the European, the United States mask and the Chinese mask. So we had to do some tests, but these tests were not available. So we had to find out a lot of other tests to do. So we found out that there was a dry particle test, And that's what we do with every new mask that we receive, every new brand or from a well-known brand, a new type. We test that, we test a new one, and then we sterilize it in two ways. Either it's with hydrogen peroxide or with steam. And I prefer to use steam if possible because it's widely available, and your chamber where you can load all your medical devices, although I cannot call it a medical device because it's personal protective material, but you can upload a lot more in your autoclave than in a H2O2 machine.
Now that you brought that up, I just have a quick question. What kind of cycle would you use for those masks?
Is that a question to me?
Yeah. Since you were using the steam sterilizer, yeah.
Oh, the steam sterilizer, we have a gravity steam sterilizer with a pre-vacuum, and we used 121 degrees with a holding time of 15 minutes. And for the other one, we have, I don't know if I'm allowed to call any brand, but you can cut it out if you want, but we have a Sterile machine from ASP, and we use the express cycle. And that also means when you use the express cycle for these fluffy things, you can only use the bottom half of your chamber. So that even means that there's a difference between how much masks you can put into one load. On contrary to Adam, we do not make all the masks personalized. So because we have a lot of departments that they collect the masks, and people from the logistics department, they run through the hospital and collect all these masks in the bags, etc., and we all do that. But before we start, Adam said one very important thing. He said we use the sterilization process to decontaminate our masks. So we do not deliver sterile products because, as he said, if it's not clean, you cannot sterilize it. I have never heard of sterilized dirt. So if it's not possible, so that's why we call it decontamination, because we do not do the cleaning step and we do not do the second step of disinfection. So it's just sterilization to decontaminate. So that's why we said everybody can use it. And then there was another question that needed to be answered, and I don't know, Adam, how you did that. How many times can you reprocess one mask?
That is a great question.
Sorry, yeah. Kevin, that I take over.
No, that's okay. Yeah, please. That's a great question. Adam, go ahead, man.
Yeah, absolutely. Kevin, take a break. Kevin, Harry and I got this.
I'll just sit back and relax here.
Yeah. Sorry, what was the question again?
The question was, how many times do you reprocess a mask, and how do you determine the number of cycles that you reprocess your mask?
Yeah, so we go by the 3M. We only process the 3M that has those kind of guidelines about which cycles and what kinds of methods are effective at killing COVID and how many times they've tested for fit infiltration. So we use the VPRO method, the Steris VPRO, which has 10 uses or up to 10 uses. And then we're also developing our own decontamination method, very similar to Duke's, where we have a BioQuell machine and it's in an enclosed chamber room. So we can load a lot of masks at once. And during that process, we're kind of developing how many times we could do it. So we're testing them for fit infiltration. We're kind of going through our own testing process. And we're actually going through the FDA's EUA process to get our method validated or get some kind of authorization from the FDA to say that our method is good. So there's a lot of testing. They want to see a lot of documentation. They want to see a lot of, what are you doing if there's something wrong? How do you identify it? Things like that. We do a lot of safety checks on our masks, visual inspection, not only before it goes through the process, but also after to make sure that nothing during that process affected the masks. Obviously, the integrity of the strap is very important in that case. So,
that begs the question, Adam, so this is obviously not just sterile processing in charge of doing all that testing and documentation. Who's working on this stuff with you?
We have a great team at our hospital that's kind of working together to submit all these documents to the FDA. They're helping us with, how to word things. We have a legal department that goes through all that kind of stuff. And then in the department, we have our sterile processing manager, myself. And we're developing this, right? We didn't know any of this before. So we're just coming up with solutions as we hit roadblocks. So it's been kind of a slow process, and there's always something new that comes up. One thing that we noticed on the masks, if anybody out there is reprocessing N95s, we noticed that on the nose piece of the masks, that foam nose piece on the N95s, it does retain a little bit more of the sterilant, especially in the hydrogen peroxide. So people have to be very careful with aeration. I know some of the methods say that there's no aeration time required or only 60 minutes required. We have an H2O2 remote sensor, and we can actually test underneath that foam piece. And we notice that it does hold it for quite a while. So at 8 to 12 hours before it really dissipates down to zero. So the aeration on those masks is very important.
That's an incredible finding, Adam. Thanks for sharing that, because there are a lot of people, I'm sure, that are out there that have been scrambling through this pandemic trying to institute these processes, and that's a pretty important finding. So I appreciate you sharing that. Have you had any experience like that, Harry, or some lessons learned through this?
Yeah. So we experienced that in the Vipro machine, it could happen. In the Sterile machine, we did not find anything like that, but we are aware that it can be possible that there might be some left. So that's why we also warn our employees, if you are going to wear a mask that is being sterilized or decontaminated via the H2O2 procedure, be aware that it can be irritating. And as soon as you find any irritation, remove your mask and put up another mask. This is the second reason why I prefer steam sterilization as a decontamination method, because that doesn't give problems like this. And one of the things that we learned, and like Adam said, we do a lot of checks before we reprocess our mask. And since we do not personalize our mask, we saw that a lot of nurses wear makeup. And makeup is not allowed in our hospital now if you wear an N95 or FFP2 mask. Since if we find makeup in the inside of a mask, we throw it away because we cannot reuse that mask. So a lot of nurses are not happy with that because they are not allowed to wear the makeup that they are used to. But still, I think we have a lot of nice-looking nurses, although they don't wear makeup anymore. So one of the things, it was a question, like you said before, what changed during this pandemic? And if you would have asked me this, it's a little bit the same answer. I'm sorry for that, like Adam said. If you would have asked me in January, hey, Harry, are you going to reprocess FFP2 mask? I would have looked at you as if you were crazy, and I would have said, are you nuts? I'm not going to do that. It's not allowed. It's not responsible. And all of a sudden, you are in the middle of something, and you cannot control it anymore. So you have to act, because the other way around, if you don't do it, all our staff is unprotected since there is nothing. And then you have to make a decision. Do we leave our staff unprotected, or are we going to leave our patients unserved with the nurses? So to prevent that, we started this. But and I said it again, safety is so important. So we had a lot of mask types and brands that were not able to pass the test to be reprocessed. But we had some brands that were able to. So we started collecting them right away before we had any measure. So if you want to know one tip, this would be my tip. If something ever, and God forbid, but if something like this ever happens again, and we can expect it because there might be a second wave of this pandemic again, if we have it a little bit under control, is if you foresee any personal protective equipment that can be a problem because of the shortage, start collecting. Since if you found a method, then at least you have something which you can reprocess. And otherwise you're too late because you've got nothing to reprocess. You have a perfect method, but nothing to reprocess. That's a little bit a shame and a waste of your time. So I think that is very important. And what I have learned from this pandemic, and I was very proud of my hospital, every department all of a sudden worked very close together, worked very smooth. And for example, we had to move our CCU unit to another part of our hospital to make place to found more ICU beds. And we did it in 3 days. And in normal times, so pre-COVID, we needed to have at least 3/4 of a year with just negotiating and talking before we could even start moving. So in 3 days. And I hope that this will stay after COVID, that everybody knows that we are working for the same goal. And 3 days might not be necessary, but somewhere between 3 days and 3/4 of a year would be very nice.
That would be very nice. And I'm glad you brought that up. That's one change that you would like to see consistent after we get to the other side of this pandemic. I just want to thank you guys because we're running out of time. So I just want to thank you so much for joining me. Thank you for sharing your lessons learned, partnering obviously with your facilities to provide your frontliners with PPE. You know, it's important, and you guys hopefully have realized even more so throughout this pandemic just how important your jobs are. So thank you, Harry. Thank you, Adam. And maybe we'll have to do this again sometime, huh?
It would be great.
Absolutely.
That wraps up our Hands Across the Water edition of Ask the Educator with guests Adam Okada and Harry Oussoren. I hope you all enjoyed the interview as much as I did. I thought they shared a lot of valuable information, including lessons learned from working through this pandemic. I hope you've been enjoying the podcast. Please remember to subscribe. You can subscribe through Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, as well as apps like Pocket Cast or iHeartRadio. Thanks again for listening. All opinions expressed on this show are those of the presenters. Before using any medical device, it is important to review the device manufacturer's instructions for use.